Hi, welcome to our show today. We are Makers, Shakers, and Mavens, which is Cooks Without Borders live video series. And thank you so much for being here. We're super excited about our program today, and we have a really big crowd, which is amazing. So thank you for that. For those of you who don't know us, we are Cooks Without Borders. I'm Leslie Brenner, and Juliet Jacobson is in one of our squares. Julie, will you raise your hand? That's Juliet, and we are Cooks Without Borders. We're a website whose mission it is to make your life more delightful and delicious by exploring food and food culture from around the world. So that means that we have lots of recipes, but it's not just about recipes, it's about the stories behind them. We take deep dives into food culture to, to explore the stories behind the recipes, which, the why and the who and the when and what is the meaning of what we're eating. So again, this is our monthly live event, and we're excited to have you here. We always feature a person or people who we find fascinating in the food world. And today our topic is the grain revolution. And we have two extremely important and exciting people. So let me first just tell you how things are going to go today. Our program will be 1 hour long. And after I introduce our esteemed guests, then we'll talk with them for about 40 minutes. And then we will start taking your questions. So you'll notice that there's at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A thing with a little thought bubble thing. So we'd love it if you would drop your questions there, and you don't need to wait till the Q&A part to start dropping questions there. Just as I'm sure things will occur to you as we're talking. There's also a raise hand thing that we're not going to use because we have noticed that we can't really notice it. It's just really hard to see it. This is the first time we're actually using this Zoom webinar platform. So hopefully we won't have any, technical glitches, but please, if we're a little, we're newbies at this platform. So please bear with us if we have any issues. And there's also a poll. So if at some point you'd like to jump into the poll and answer the questions, or they're like your relationship to bread and things like that. So it's a fun little poll. And
wait, how do you access the poll, Leslie?
The poll is at the bottom of your screen also. It should be. Do you guys see it?
I don't, but maybe because I'm
hopefully people who are attending can see it. Let's see. So with that, I'm going to introduce our guests. We have Roxana Jullapat, who is, I should say that I'm joining from Dallas, Texas, and Juliet is in Ashfield, which is in rural Northwest Massachusetts. And Roxana Jullapat is joining us from Los Angeles. And Roxana is the renowned head baker and co-owner of Friends and Family, which is an amazing, wonderful cafe and sort of restaurant featuring a lot of baked goods in East Hollywood. And she's also the author of Mother Grains, which just came out in April. Mother Grain, Recipes for the Grain Revolution. And it's an amazing, wonderful, fantastic book that I think is really destined to become a classic, and everybody should own it. And it's super, I'm not a really good baker, but I've managed to make some, blow everybody away delicious things from this book. So highly, highly recommend. We reviewed it at Cooks Without Borders, so you can find it there, and you can also buy it through our bookshop. And then we also have David Kaisel, and David is the founder of Capay Mills. I'm sorry. I should also go back and say that Roxana, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at this. Roxana, she came up through some of the best restaurants in LA, for instance, Campanile and Luke and AOC. So she's, and then she also had her own place with her husband, who's a chef, Daniel Mattern. Am I saying his name right?
You are.
Okay. And their restaurant was called Cooks County. So that was before she opened Friends and Family. So David is the founder of Capay Mills, and that is an artisan community mill. I'm going to get this all wrong, but you'll correct me, David. In Rumsey, California, which is in Northern California, and so far we're okay, right?
So far, so
And
well, here in Rumsey.
he founded it in 2015 and has survived wildfires in 2019 and was, just as you were really getting your business off the ground, that fire destroyed a lot of stuff, including some fields, I guess, because you own some fields that you farm and also source from some fields.
No, I farm the road. So what I grow on is through the courtesy and friend of neighbors and friends along the highway here.
Okay.
But,
cool.
no, I just lost equipment. It's all machinery. That's all replaceable.
Okay. So, but what happened was, after that, COVID happened and people started baking a lot and things got very, very busy for David. He sells his flowers at mostly at farmers markets around Northern California. Is that right? And then, but it's on your website, you have a list of all the places that you can buy it.
Yeah, I saw about half goes through farmers markets. The others either online or through either wholesale to restaurants and bakeries around the region, or is that online, or through a couple of specialty grocers as well.
Okay, cool. And if you are a home baker who wants to explore these fabulous products, Cooks Without Borders actually, our cook shop has, you can see Capay Mills grains, his flowers through our cook shop. It'll take you directly to his site. So you don't have to remember how to do that. You could just go to Cooks Without Borders and then enter straight through there if you like. So, and some of David's customers are extremely famous and exciting bakers and pastry chefs, Dominique Cran and Lazy Dog and Lazy Bear. I've been out of California too long. It's really terrible. I feel like I'm so out of every loop. Anyway, so I would like to sort of start by asking you, Roxana, what is the grain revolution, and why is it important? And which I think also partly, and also how and why did you become a baker? So I know it's a big, it's kind of a lot. Any piece of that you want to tackle right off the bat would be great.
So let's start at the beginning then. So the easiest part is becoming a baker. So I, like many people in my profession, I found myself in baking school or cooking school. Eventually I graduated and I kept applying for jobs at small restaurants close to my neighborhood, which is kind of like a bustling, hipstery kind of neighborhood. So it made sense to work in independent small restaurants in my neighborhood. And my dream was like, I won't have to drive, which is a miracle here in Los Angeles. So I did that. I found a job and eventually they put me in the pastry station. Eventually, I mean like 3 hours into my first shift. And I liked it. I'm like, okay, I guess I don't have to work the line. This is interesting and equally demanding. And after a few months, I said to myself, well, if I'm going to work pastry, I really want to work for someone who's excellent. And I called like 3 times the kitchen line at Campanile until somebody actually responded and said, like, they will be like, we're not hiring, bye. And eventually somebody called me back, and I kind of like insisted that they hire me. They were not necessarily looking for someone, and I wasn't particularly good or fast. And it was an incredibly challenging environment in many ways because it made me realize that you have to fully commit. You can't be a little bit into baking. You have to go for it, Mm-hmm. So I was old enough and mature enough to like know that was going to be a shift in my career. I had graduated from the School of Journalism, and I didn't rule out that one day I would probably pursue that. And as we know, restaurant jobs don't pay very much, especially when you're like the plater that makes just a few cents more than the dishwasher. So I kept my day job to make sure that I could pay rent, and then I would go play desserts at Company. So, you know, then, you know, in time I got to move up and have staff of my own and be the pastry chef of other restaurants. And I always pride in using seasonal produce and amazing fruits in California, which is seriously like the easiest decision any bakery in California could ever make. Like, oh yeah, let me use the best fruit available. Easy, right? One trip to a farmer's market, and it's like the work is done for you. So that was always my focus and the source of all kinds of creative endeavors. And then it was slowly but very consistently, I started to see that there was a presence of grain within my farming community, which extends to the entire state of California, to be truthful. Because that's how great the LA market is. It's worth for farmers to really come all the way here to showcase their product. So I kind of knew, like, in my gut, that was going to be my next ingredient. So I looked at it kind of like the way I look at cherries and apples and nectarines and pears, and it became sort of like something that I was going to buy from a local producer, and that was going to make a difference to a independent family farm. So that's how the whole thing happened. So in response to the part where, like, why do we say it's a revolution? I feel that revolutions, we can say it because we have evidence, happen because there's a lot of tiny little steps that reach this add up to this climatic moment in which we're like, what is this explosion? What is this like cathartic event that really makes it clear that something new is afoot? So I would say that we kind of at some point within the last 5 years have been experimenting a perfect storm where there's like people with the know-how to bake with whole grain, farmers with product available for us to use, and customer interest, and complete lack of hesitation when it comes to like experience this product, pay for it, understand that it benefits a more local, more at-hand economy.
There was a part in your book where you mentioned that when you were about to open Friends and Family, I think you were planning it, and you asked yourself, like, do we dare to like open without a single white bread?
Yeah.
So
we were like, really, like, this could go wrong, you know?
But it didn't,
terribly,
right?
terribly sideways.
Yeah, and what was very interesting is that I was so ready to give everybody the speech. This is why you have to eat these foods. This is why you have to support bakeries that push a grain forward agenda. This is what it means to your local grainscape. And interestingly enough, I never have had to sell it to anyone. People at the end of the day just want a solid baked good. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I hope that those who are paying attention know that they're actually eating like really good flour and really good grain.
I think they do. So David, thank you for that, Roxana. That was wonderful to hear. David, can you tell us how you became interested in grains and how you came to found a mill?
Well, when I was 14, actually, my first job was actually in a restaurant the likes of which probably barely exist anymore, working for a French chef in a little bistro in Menlo Park, California. And my boss's family had run a cooking school in Vichy in France for umpteen generations, and he was very much old school. And so I've always cooked. My mother was a fantastic cook. I love to eat. I grew up in a family where that was there was a lot of emphasis on that. And anyway, it was great to be in an environment that was kind of, as I said, difficult to find, I think, these days, how simple that kitchen was, tiny as well. Fast forward many, many years. I'd worked in restaurants on and off, including in LA, and in my 20s and 30s, and loved the business. But I'd also lived and worked on farms and loved that, which at the time was not a viable career pursuit, was not thought of as a viable career pursuit, perhaps in the way that it is now. So
Mhm.
I pursued separate career, which involved a lot of travel, which introduced me to a lot of food, which was wonderful. And I ended up at one point actually working in Kenya and interviewing farmers for an I was a product designer and I was designing agricultural equipment, working with farmers there and seeing the incredible diversity of these farms. These small farmers were running in Kenya, where they'd have everything from fish ponds to, tomatoes and peppers and corn and grains and all these, different products in a really diversified farming system, and recognizing that that was not just a matter of health and taste, but it also was a matter of resilience, that diversity, how important the diversity of different food sources was in a precarious environment like that.
Right.
And yet, and I realized how important grains were as well as a sort of traditional, historically, it's our first crop. And agricultural systems were often based on grains, and yet they'd become absolutely opaque in our kitchens these days. There's probably no ingredient that we know less about than the flour we use, where it comes from, how it's made, what it takes to produce it. And I just started putting those links together and realizing how fascinating it was to me. And I was at a point in my life as well where I was ready for change. And I loved the idea of going back to producing something that you could eat. But I was getting too old to bend down and pick vegetables and row crops and things like that.
You needed a taller crop.
Grain, right. Grains, I can just jump on a machine and I can drive a tractor and a combine and don't have to bend over so much to pick it. Well, that ended up not quite being the case, but that got me into it. And then as I started digging, I just realized how much depth and complexity there was there. From, one side is the agronomy side, which I'm involved with and which I find absolutely fascinating. The other side is the use and the milling and the processing side, which appeals to the industrial designer in me, and the history of it. And I also have worked in public health, so the nutritional aspects are really important to me as well.
Mhm.
And it just was such a rich topic to work in. I knew that I'll never run out of challenges and aspects of it to explore. So, and that's the way it's been. I feel like I'm not even scratched the surface at this point. So I dare not call myself an expert on any of this, but
Well,
Well,
you learned so much. I
fascinating.
mean, I remember when you first started being interested in this, and you took that trip to Italy and stayed there for
Mhm.
months studying mills and
Yeah.
learning about heirloom wheats, and I'm sure you've been doing that kind of deep research ever since.
I've made a lot of friends through it. Let's put it that way. It's a fascinating community. And, Roxana knows that at least as well, that it's, I think we're working in a discipline where none of us make enough money. So passion, we're driven by passion. We're driven by something more intrinsic, I think, about what
Right.
what brings us here. And I find that incredibly satisfying. I was talking with a customer, came to pick up some flour at the shop this morning, and she's a baker in Davis, and she was saying, she doesn't charge her customers. She just loves the response she gets from people eating her whole grain or her sourdough breads. And I said, boy, it's wonderful that she can afford to do that.
How does she pay her rent?
But it's also true, there's just, I think I feel like I'm in the business as much of education as anything.
Mhm.
And we're opening up, this grains are traditionally 60% of the calories that we consume,
Right.
Hmm.
that we know so little about. And when people start to unpack that and understand what goes on to it, they get really turned on. They get really excited about it.
Dude,
And I love seeing that, they're paying attention to all they're eating and where it comes from and what the consequences are. And suddenly, engaged consumers, which is, I
do you
don't know.
find that your customers, like at the farmers markets, that they really want to know a lot about the grain that they're about to bake with? Or are they just interested in
they
sort of the
do.
baking properties?
Well, I think it's important to understand that. I mean, grains are a crop like anything else.
Mhm.
And there's, wheat is not wheat. There are tens of thousands of varieties of wheat. Again, we've been growing it longer than anything else. Domesticated longer than anything else. And they're all really distinct. There's incredible differences between them, between the flavors, between how they bake, between where they grow, how they grow. This incredible diversity and richness. And from a cook's perspective or a baker's perspective, it's just this huge palette to work with, which people get really excited about.
I think
But
Roxana's book
then,
does a good job of communicating that point, that there's a big
Yeah.
palette to work with.
Yeah.
absolutely, and that's what I love about it, is she really focuses on the distinct characters of these different grains. I mean, the drum I beat is to say, and this has to do something with the revolution you're talking about, Roxana. I think that, my dream would be to see grains, becoming decommodified in the way that
Yes.
grapes and chocolate and coffee, were
Yes.
once all commodities. It
Yeah.
used to be Folgers, Hershey's, and Gallo. And now look where
Right.
we are, with all of those, people have
Mm.
seen the differences in them all. And there's at least that much diversity
Yeah.
in character in grains. And I'm just talking wheat. The other
Right.
great thing about
Right.
Roxana's book is that wheat's the last chapter. I love the fact, that you start out, hey, wait a minute, there's all these other really exciting, really interesting foods out there, great, cereals out there that, we've here in the US, we haven't even scratched the surface for
Right.
those.
Roxana, can you, thank you, David. That was, you have so much to share with us. I think, I'm sorry that this program doesn't last for 3 hours, because maybe we'll do it again. Maybe we'll have like a part B. Roxana, can you just sort of give us a little bit of an overview about what the 8 ancient grains in your book are?
Right. So, when I said I want to write a cookbook about grains, I like the first mission was, okay, it can't just be any grain, because I have prejudice against some grains. So I'm like, okay, what is it about? Why is it that I love Sonora wheat, but I can't stand quinoa? What's the difference between those two things? And it's a completely idiosyncratic. It has nothing to do with flavor. And when I think of Sonora wheat, I think of a wheat that has such a history here in Southern California and California at large, that it represents so much about who we are culturally, even from the name, It also is a flour that was so predominant here 100 years ago. It's also a flour that is not dominating right now. Like, is the majority of the local farmers that grow wheat are growing successfully really great Sonora. It also means that is a flour that lends itself to a lot of other California produce, because things that grow together kind of taste together. And I don't know why that is, but it kind of always seems to be true. And then I think of quinoa, and I think of why it got to be so popular. And I think it's just had really great PR. You know, it has a
Like
great
kale.
story. It has a great story. It comes from the Andes. Like this ancient civilizations eat it, and it's fabulous, and it's so healthy and rich in protein. And yeah, and I don't mean to take anything away from the cultures that love and embrace quinoa, but it seems like such an appropriated crop, and something that we just kind of like made popular through diet fads and such. And it really this comparison exemplified to me what the grain movement really is about. It's not about going to Whole Foods or any fancy supermarket and looking for the most wholesome looking bag out there with really clever marketing. It really is about what are those grains with that are representative of who we are as a country. You know, these are staples that have built the nation, that have deep roots in their specific regions. They are part of our cultures and subcultures, and they're constantly evolving. And we are if they're also sort of like endangered, like if we don't acknowledge their presence and what they have done to us and what they reflect about our history, then we lose them, you know. So there's definitely a great sense of a mission about the book. And these 8 grains that I chose, which are barley, buckwheat, corn, oat, sorghum, rye, rice, and wheat, all of these grains 100% represent that all that I was talking about: history, economy, cultural attachment, and future also. So that's the root of Mother Grains.
Very cool.
So there's no real, I mean, they happen to be ancient, but there wasn't really a scientific term behind modern grains, except the fact that we genetically can trace their origins back to millennia. So
okay. David, something you said about, you know, that sort of analogy about coffee and chocolate, and, you know, that we will sort of get there with this. It's interesting because I was kind of thinking about like when we were kids, not when Roxana was a kid, but when we three were kids, like you would get a Hershey bar or something. And that's what we knew about chocolate.
That was it.
And and then as it turns out, like, and we thought that was like candy, right? And actually it turns out that chocolate has some really interesting, you know, nutritional properties. And so like, you know, white flour is like, you know, a poison, right? I mean, maybe, you know, some people think, you know, but actually like if you think about the whole grains, like in the nutrition and the incredible flavor, and Roxana, I do love that you really talk about like the, you know, it can't just be about health. It has to be about flavor. And which sort of brings up this other sort of interesting question about processed, refined grains, and why. I know, David, I know you have a lot to say on the subject, and there's tons to say about refined grains and mixing refined, you know, but Roxana, like in your book, why is it, if it's a book about the grain revolution, why is it that you've included, you know, that refined grains are actually an important part of probably most of the recipes? Right. So, as I have become more and more proficient with whole grain baking, I realized, and as I've become a teacher of whole grain baking, even with just my staff, but with the public at large, I've realized that we're always looking for that quick recipe that works, that is successful, etc. Right? Sure, you know, you're a recipe developer yourself, right? I would say that I want to meet, like, the mission of Mother Grains is like, I want to talk about
grains to people. I want to seduce them into coming to the table to taste these incredible products, because I know that the minute they explore, they will be interested and want to explore even more. It's totally alert, but I also want people to be successful. And I experienced this in my own bakery. I want these kids to succeed because it's my success, right? But I also want home bakers to succeed, because if they start to fail at whole grain baking, they won't do it again. So there, as we gain the skill of whole grain baking, it's important to use some refined flour that is somewhat consistent, just so that they succeed in certain projects. The most incredible thing that happens, and that I love seeing as an effect of baking this way, is that after making a few recipes, you make 3, you find yourself increasing the amount of whole grain in a recipe. It just seems, it just seems to take you that way. And I feel like in the recipes, I definitely make notes to like when this is appropriate, when this is like, yes, go for it, you can do it, it's gonna be great. But for sure, like we're talking about a huge diversity of product. And each individual grain with its own intricacies and challenges and different properties. So what refined all-purpose or refined bread flour does for me as a teacher is guaranteed my audience's success. And at the end of the day, I just want people to bake, and this does the work. But trust me, I want you to be a whole grain baker. I want you to go for 100%.
Well, it's really funny because I am totally not a baker, and I started, I've baked a few loaves, and I sort of start like, bake some white, no knead, whatever, because I'm not disciplined enough to do the to care for a sourdough. So, the first place I want to go is like, okay, I'm going to do 100% whole grain. And, and I did that, and it's like, you don't want to do that. It's like,
it was a doorstop.
But then for me, it was the opposite process. It was like, okay, how much can I get it? Then I start putting some white flour in it. And, like, what is that happy place? David, do you bake bread?
I do constantly.
Yeah. So
and
what do you
I'll
do?
tell you, there's I think our generation, I'm speaking of the 3 of us, Leslie, Julie, and I, have an advantage in this world in that at least I grew up with the horror of doorstop bread. Grew up in California, and I do remember that late 1960s paradigm of the whole grain loaf, that if you dropped it, you'd break your toe on it, these horrible brick-like things. And I've since then, I kind of grew up with this horror.
Eating healthy was painful then.
That's right.
Yeah. Exactly. Like you knew, it was something you had to put all your attention into. And, so and when I started milling, that was kind of my biggest fear, honestly, is whatever you do, avoid the doorstop bread. And as with many people, and I think we owe a huge debt of thanks to Chad Robertson and others, of course, who kind of started this current revolution in bread baking. But he said 10% whole grain flour in his country loaf, and the rest, using a sifted all-purpose flour. And I made my first loaf following that recipe, and it was a miracle. It was this amazing thing. And the number of customers now that I have said, they come up and tell me, I made my first loaf of bread, and they send me the picture like their baby picture of their first loaf. It's beautiful and it's wonderful. But Roxana's absolutely right. That was facility, I think that was very intentional and very smart on from Chad's perspective. Make sure people have the thrill of success to start out with, and then, and you're right, then they make a couple of those loaves and said, hey, this is cool. I can make a loaf of bread. Now what? And the next thing they do is they're coming to me and saying, so what have you got that, what can I do now that I figured out how to make a loaf of bread. And I say, okay, well, here are my flours. Don't use it 100% because they're all whole grain flours, but try 50%. Okay, try
Right.
50% of this. You know how to bake bread, you know how to make the bread now, and see where that gets you and what your family says and your friends say, and work from there. You know, we're already so far ahead of the curve. You know, if they're
Right.
using 50% whole grain flour compared to what where we're coming from.
Mhm.
And sure enough, you know, I do most of my breads at 70 or 80% whole grain. I'll still keep, you know, personally, I like about 20%, you know, high extraction flour in there, just a little bit lighter so I don't break my toe when I drop it. But, you know, there are no rules. This whole thing is, you know, you do what makes you happy and what your family's going to eat. You know, I've got so many customers that say, well, every Saturday we make whole grain pancakes for our family and the kids love it. You know, where are they going to get whole grain pancakes otherwise? You know, it's fantastic. I just,
Fantastic.
yeah. And that's how the revolution starts.
Yeah, yeah.
That's where it goes.
David, can
Um,
I ask you a quick question about freshness? Do
yeah,
you, since you're the miller and you can eat the absolute freshest
yeah.
flour, can you taste a real difference, or can you describe what the difference is, if there isn't one?
Boy, yeah, it's so this has been the excuse. I mean, the idea that flour, whole grain flour has a shelf life
Mhm.
is in a lot of ways what drove the whole move towards roller milling and
Oh.
reduction milling, where you're separating the bran and the germ out because that's where all the oils are in the grain.
And that's
And
what
wheat has
goes.
quite a bit of oil in it.
Mhm.
A lot of the nutrition is in there. You know, most of the vitamins and minerals are in the bran and the germ, but they also oxidize. It's also very volatile. The oils are very volatile and they'll
Mm.
oxidize quite quickly. There are folks that'll say, and it's true. I mean, it's going to start oxidizing as soon as you mill it. The question is, you know, how much do you lose over time? Um, you know, when I read that your flour is going to be rancid a couple of weeks, personally, I've not found that.
Uh-huh.
I don't necessarily agree. I think that, and I tell my customers, keep the most important thing is to keep the air off of it. It's not, um, you know, if you keep your flour in a sealed container, you're going to keep the oxygen off of it. It's going to last longer. Put it in the freezer or the fridge. Keep it cool. That helps as well.
Mhm.
And I tell folks, you know, I think the flour is fine for a month or two, like that. You're always, you know, it's at its peak when you first mill it, flavor wise. Now, bakers, commercial bakers, in fact, this is another part of the equation. Bleached flour didn't have to do completely with the idea of making white flour. It had to do with oxidizing
Hmm.
the starches in the flour,
So the
and
bleach
you do
stabilizes
get
it?
better
Mhm.
baking qualities. There's a little more stability to the gluten development in flour that has some aids, that the starch is aged or
Mhm.
oxidized to a certain extent.
Hmm.
And so that was done artificially by adding bleach or chemicals, chlorine, all sorts of things to flours for many years. It's not done as much now, but so there's different different things. Commercial bakers might want an aged flour
Huh.
and still do.
Wow.
Huh.
But I think for home bakers, and especially if you're using, you know, a high extraction or whole grain flour, you know, the point is you're going for the flavor, you're going for the nutrition. That's never going to be higher than when the flour is freshly milled.
So, Roxana, you had some good tips in your book about like when you buy flour to make sure that it's fresh. Like how do you
How do you do that?
what do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, this is getting easier and easier, and I mean, I I get so gaga for like Millers. I'm such a fangirl. Like I'm really enjoying David's company here. Um, I learned so much, and it's just like it really because I'm a baker, and my colleagues and even like my workers, we have learned so much just from working with the flour. But it's amazing all that we don't know, and anytime my local miller comes visit. It's like, we're all like, what? It's really fascinating, all that we don't know. It really highlights how we are an interdependent system, and that to have a grain revolution, a grain movement, we really need all these parts pulling through. And there would be no mother grains without people like David, and I mean it 100%, not just because he's here. It really is the reason why we can bake this great, creative, and delicious way. So I think that the best source of information about how to treat the flour is the source, right? So, but in general terms, what happens is that now we have this access. Now we can order Capay Mills online. We can order from non-color here, those of us who bake here in Los Angeles. You could even go to a bougie, kind of fancy-ish, great grocery store and find some really good freshy flour from your neck of the woods. So this mission has gotten a lot easier, but there was a time, and that it wasn't that long ago, where you had to like go to a Whole Foods, for example, and buy a bag of flour and figure it out, you know. And it was not uncommon that you would open a bag and get a whiff of that rancidity. A rancid flour has a very characteristic smell. It's off-putting, just like a rancid oil is off-putting.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes it's just a hint, but then you bake with it and you're like, that was a funky batch of flour. And it's important, I always say, like, you open your bag, especially if you're shopping at a more generic supermarket, grocery store type of place, and definitely like go ahead and pull a handful, smell it, clump it. Fresh flour will clump a lot more. It also, I mean, I find little mites in flour before. Like, make sure that it looks like healthy flour. And it's important that we learn to read healthy flour. What does that look like? And I taste it, honestly, for many reasons, because I really want to know what it tastes like, because I want to see if it's going to be funky. And then once you get home, I think like the easiest way, especially if you're me and you have like all kinds of odds and ends of flour, just like pull the air out, just how David says, make sure that it's sort of like well covered. And at home, I refrigerate because I don't go through it that often. Like, really, usually what I'm making is a pancake. But at the bakery, we go through it quite fast. So even my freshly milled flour, even in the summer, like we'll have like 300 pounds of a hard white, for example. We never refrigerated. We're going through it fast enough that that we don't feel like it's gonna spoil, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, we all have that thing that is just like, ooh, I got some precious flour from my in southern in San Diego, so you save it for a special occasion. I don't know if I'm the only person who does this. It's very obnoxious, because then like my entire staff is like, why do we have this? Can we use it?
You don't want to look at my shelf, Roxana.
Yeah, right. Like the precious flour.
So
Save it for somebody's birthday, or I do that all the time. But yes, I think it's cool to like, for sure. Like, I mean, I'm like, beyond the fact that they are somewhat precious and very, very special flowers, it's really important to like open that bag, like dig in, like make sure that you know what it smells like before you even bake. Somebody here in the chat is pointing out that they freeze the flour. People freeze the flour all the time. I started to recommend people to refrigerate and freeze their flour, because I started to get really freaked out that I was sending people to buy really good flour and that it could potentially spoil. But I agree with David that it has definitely a longer shelf life than 2 weeks. Sometimes I say 2 weeks just to play it very safe, you know, like when the expiration date is like far sooner than it needs to be in the can or something like that. I'm guilty of that. But yeah, I find that it's not even here in LA, which is really, really hot. Yeah. And even our room temperature is usually running in the low 70s or high 70s. It's not. It's gonna be fine.
Yeah.
Your flour is gonna be fine, especially if you're buying from a really good source.
Mhm.
Okay,
One
so
thing I do, I mark the mill date on all my flours.
I've
rather
done
Oh,
than
that. Yes,
That's
that's
for
great.
great.
Do mo-
Everybody
So-
should do that.
yeah, do
Or
mo- do
first
most
mistake. Or
do most
first
artisan millers do that?
I don't know.
Mm.
I mean,
Mm,
commercial flour usually has a sell-by date, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that's different.
there's nothing mandated, there's
No.
no regulation around that, and you have no idea when it was milled.
Right, but the
So-
good olive
Yeah.
oils and the coffees, their coffees are saying their roasting date, and olive oils are
Right.
saying their pressing date, and yeah.
right.
Okay, I
It's
would
the
love to get to, we have some really great questions
All right.
from our attendees. So thank you, everybody. We're going to start getting to those. And then Juliet, I know you have some questions as well. So we'll just try to go back and forth a little bit. But here's one from Rita asking, can you speak more regarding the history of Sonora wheat? Which, is, yeah, really cool question.
Mhm. They're
That's
various.
all you,
ways to
David.
get it. Okay, well, so the story I first got that Sonora basically was the first, so you need to bear in mind, wheat is not indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, okay? Corn was grown here, and quinoa, and amaranth, and other grains, but we didn't have wheat. It comes from the Fertile Crescent, from the Middle East. So it didn't arrive here until the Europeans arrived, basically in the 15th century. And supposedly Sonora is one of the, they can trace it back as being one of the original varieties that came in.
Wow.
I think it's interesting that it's probably the reason why flour tortillas dominate in northern Mexico compared to corn, mainly because places like the Sonora Desert are too dry in a lot of areas to grow corn.
Huh.
So I love Sonora because, as I tell folks, you could throw it out in a Walmart parking lot and you'll have something to eat at the end of the season. I mean, the stuff is just tough as nails. It's really robust. It's a wonderful grain to grow. It
Right.
doesn't yield much. It was the mainstay grain grown in California, which up until the early 1900s was the second or third biggest producer of grain in the country, or wheat in the country, which people don't realize. They think it's all in the Midwest. But that was all Sonora here in California because you don't need to irrigate it, because it's very disease resistant, and because it bakes really well. It's a white wheat that you can use for pastries. You can use it, it's strong enough for breads.
Wow.
It's got great flavor.
I think you're sold out of it, right? I think I tried to buy it from
In
capaymills.com.
fact, I've been fielding, as we've been talking here, I've been fielding some texts from the grower I work with, who were actually recovering some of it from a mill out of state where it went to, and we're trying to get it back here because
Because you need it.
our
Where it
drought
belongs.
is, well, it's so this is a different topic, but this is part of the challenge, and this answers a little bit of one of the questions in the first question from Emma way back when, about effective ways to spread the local grain and the whole grain revolution to a mass audience. One of our biggest challenges, especially with the varieties like Sonora we're talking about, is we're tiny amounts are being grown compared to this industrial model of commodity grains, where hundreds of thousands of acres are grown at a time, and the whole economies of scale that go along with that. We've got a whole economic system we're trying to change here to increase the value of grains like Sonora, to say, hey, this is something that's actually worth paying for. I'm not sure percentage-wise, but I'd say most of the wheat grown in the US is grown at a loss to the farmer. Okay. It's
Wow.
subsidized one way or another. There are very
Oh.
few farmers that make money growing grains. It'll be a part of a
Yeah.
rotational crop.
Wow,
There are
that's
other
incredible.
reasons why it's grown. And here in California, it's a dying industry because you can make much more money on an acre of land planting olives, planting grapes, planting sunflowers.
Huh.
And until we create value, until we give wheat value, the grains, not just wheat, but grains, the value that they, I think they should have nutritionally as an ingredient, it's going to be very difficult to create a mass market for these specialty grains. And I think that's what we're, this is part of the revolution that we're fighting. And I think, the encouraging thing to me is we've seen how that's worked in like microbreweries, how, the idea that it's certain malts and certain hops and, that you can take, again, what used to be Budweiser,
Right.
Mhm.
For $4 of 6-pack.
that was the model, along with the Hershey's and the Gallo and the Folgers coffee. And now look at where that, that economy has gone and how many businesses have grown up around it.
Yeah.
And I'm just recently started working with Admiral Maltings in Alameda, which is this fantastic floor malting facility where they hand malt these grains that are grown literally here. So I'm now milling grains that are grown here. They go to Alameda to get malted. They're absolutely unique, and they're the most flavorful things I've ever seen.
Wow.
They're just
That's
fantastic. But they're adding value to it.
Yeah.
My point is, we're shifting the perception from a commodity to a specialty product.
Yeah. So
and that's when we'll start. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to ask why, why it's important to support, local mills. And I think you just answered that question. I mean,
my point, flour mills used to be the primary piece of infrastructure that connected growers to consumers to customers in rural communities. At one point, there was one mill for every 60 people in the US in the 19th century.
Wow.
We now have about 68, 70 mills in the country. Okay.
Wow.
Italy alone
God.
has something like 10 times that many mills.
Wow.
Okay, but they're small mills, they're community mills, because there's a system still there where growers are connected with local consumers, growing local grains that are adapted to that region, to the climate, to the types of breads they're making. And you have this diversity, that comes out of the agriculture, and that's where the mill is the machinery that facilitates all of that.
Yeah.
And that's why I'd love to see small towns like Rumsey here, or small towns, in the Midwest, rebuild that kind of economy that, farmers have lost all control over the pricing. They've lost any identity about, the customers don't know where the grain comes from. It all goes to Minneapolis, get milled. It goes through 3 or 4 mega, organizations that do all the processing, and it's totally anonymous. So we don't value.
But we're starting to, and that's why we're here.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
That's why it's
So,
exciting.
okay, here is a question from Gretchen. I've bought whole wheat flour from King Arthur, whom I love, but I read that there are varying amounts of whole wheat flour, even in brands that are labeled 100%. How can I know that I'm getting 100% whole wheat or whole grain?
I know.
Okay, great.
Buy your flour from a reputable independent mill, because whole grain is actually the easiest part of the process, right? It means this entire kernel or group of kernels went in through a mill and came out 100%. Nothing was removed. It just went into your paper bag, right? That's 100% whole grain flour. And you have to have some trust in your miller to know that they really didn't pull out any parts except perhaps a little stem here or there. But when you go for commodity wheat, you're buying industrial wheat, and it's going to go through crazy manipulation. It's a even whole grain flour, whole wheat flour from King Arthur is a very highly processed product. Yes.
So does that mean that it's not, you're describing two different things. One is you are getting every part of the berry, wheat berry that went into the mill, you're buying in your bag. And the other model is yes, the flour in this bag has some parts of the endosperm and some parts of the bran and some parts, but it's not what went
Well,
into the
because
mill.
the process and the reason what makes the more commodity whole wheat process, right? That I call it manufacturer or process or factory flour is because it is milled massively, right? Probably roller milled. And then it is separated, meaning bran and starch are separated, and then they're concocted into a blend again to make a whole grain flour. That is how the whole grain flour that makes those like loaves that can break your toe is prepared, right? So it's interesting to me, and I find it like so. I mean, obviously, just probably reflects how little I know about the milling business, but I find it fascinating and rather disturbing that mills of every size, you know, with very few exceptions, are still sifting their flours. And it sounds to me that like, but you are losing weight and you make money or you charge per weight. Why are we doing this?
Well,
You know?
it's not
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
What's that?
It's not quite true. So,
Please do explain.
excuse me. So there's I think a really important distinction to make. And again, it gets a little bit into the machinery. We talk about roller mills, stone mills. Those are the tools you use. But roller milling, I mean, if you talk to millers, they talk about reduction milling. It's actually the process that describes what goes on in commodity flour. It's not so much, the mill is just a machine. It's two rolls that do a very efficient job of separating the components in the grain. And you know, we should back up a little bit for those who, you know, we haven't explained this to. You know, wheat is bran, the outer layer, the endosperm, which is the starchy part in the middle, which is the bulk of the grain, and then the germ, which is, you know, the baby plant, basically, where most of the nutrition and enzymes and everything else are in there. So 3 components in the grain. Bran is really not, it's the part that's not really digestible, and it's the part that gets separated out. It's also, though, where there's a lot of the nutrition, a lot of the flavor, a lot of the color in the grain.
Fiber, right?
And
Fiber.
I'm sorry.
And the
And
fiber.
fiber.
Yeah, and the fiber and everything. So reduction milling using roller mills, that typically, I mean, that gets separated into about 20 different product streams. It goes through these mills, it gets sifted, it goes back into the mill, gets sifted again, it goes through all these different grades of screens and separators, and very precisely separated into all these different product streams, which all have different uses. So even the bran, that doesn't get thrown away. That gets sold to feed, you know, companies that are making feed for cattle and animals and dog food and that kind of thing. And it's valuable. It's very valuable. That's how commercial mills work, but they're also producing over 1 million pounds. You know, they can produce 1 million pounds of flour in a day.
Wow.
I'm lucky, my mill right now, if I can produce 500,000 pounds a day, that's a big deal. I'm going to scale up and maybe I'll do 1 million pounds a year, not a day. Okay.
Okay.
It's a whole different thing.
Yeah. Okay. Catherine has, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I would love, we have like 2 more minutes. I don't really want to go too much over because we try not to do that in respect of everybody's time. And I will promise that I will ask these guys to answer any questions that don't get answered, and we'll email them to you. But I think we could, these look like pretty quick questions. So Catherine is asking Roxana, what's the local mill you mentioned that you buy from in LA? And can anyone buy, or is that just wholesale?
Anyone can buy her. They're called Grist and Toll, and they can be found online. And it's gristandtoll.com.
Okay. Great. Okay. I just put the name in the chat. Okay. And let's see. From Norman, are there harmful effects of consuming wheat flour?
I'd say there are harmful effects of consuming anything if you consume too much of it or in the wrong way. Wheat flour in itself is a grass. It's what we do with it. There are a lot of different, if you consume wheat as whiskey, yes, there'll be harmful effects.
There are consequences.
Doesn't mean it's any of the wheat's to blame for it.
Okay,
Okay.
two more real quick questions, and then I have actually a question to kind of wrap up that I'd like to ask Roxana. But is there a mill map? Rita is asking if there's a mill map of the U.S. or a mill trail. Rita's from Houston, and she tries to buy from Barton Springs. Oh, I buy from them, which is near Austin. But yeah, is there a mill map online or anything?
There's one for California, certainly. The California Wheat Commission has a great one called Golden State Grains .org, I believe. And they're doing a really good job of listing what's available here in California and perhaps out of the state. I'm not sure if there's a national map. Some, Roxana, you may know, like Breadtopia, some of the websites, some of the baking websites, I believe, do have pretty good.
And
oh, I know.
you know, I have to say, sorry to interrupt, but through the entire process in which I was writing the cookbook, I saw a lot of meals come and go through out of the grain stratosphere, so to speak, and that just, you know, illustrates how hard it is to make it in the business. You know, it's really tough.
I would definitely go. One other place to go to is Amy. Flourambassador.com.
Flower Ambassador, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Flower.
Okay.
She's an author. It's also written really great books about the business. But Amy, I think, has a pretty comprehensive list of resources nationally.
Okay. Quick, one more question, and then I have a question for Roxana. This is actually, it looks in the chat like it's from Juliet Jacobson, but it's from her son Milo. Is it worth he would like your opinions about home bakers taking the step to mill their own flour. Is it worth it? And where might be a good place to start?
All right. Is this for me, right? Okay, so I will say, as someone who has tried to mill at home and who has used really, really incredible flour milled by people who know how to mill, this is what I will say. I will say that think of it the way you think of a baker. Like, you want to eat a great loaf of bread, you go to a great bakery and buy great bread. Can you make great bread at home? Absolutely, right? If you try and you are methodic and really pay attention to detail and have great ingredients, you'll probably going to create great bread. I'm very sensitive to the nuances of really, really great flour. However, if you so it is an investment and you can get good at it. I think buying a really good mill will cost you about $400 to $500. Then you have to buy great berries, right? And then I do recommend keeping your berries cool, like either in the freezer or in the refrigerator, just so that as they go through the stone milling process, they don't warm up too much. Also keep in mind that you might find yourself sifting a little bit depending on what you're doing, just because you may not be a great grinder, you may not be a great miller, and especially starting out. So is it worth it? I think it can be, especially if you're baking small batches in your family or just for your family at home. But there's really, really great flour out there and people that really need to sell it. So do know that also, that you have access to really great flour.
That's a really good point. Okay. So what I wanted to ask you, Roxana, is something that you alluded to just when we were, chatting before we started the webinar. You're working on a new book.
I'm thinking about it. Yes, I'm thinking about it.
Can you tell us briefly about it? Yes,
I wanna. So I talk about mother grains at meeting people where they're at as step one, about as sort of like a lure to get you and everybody else to bake with whole grain flours and getting to know ancient grains that we may perhaps never heard of, like sorghum, or like try your hand at rye, which is so mythical for so many home bakers. But now I want to move on into whole grain baking, which I do often, all the time, very successfully, by the way. I want people to bake with whole grain exclusively, or as much as possible. And there's many different amazing ways to go about it. So I'm starting to think that that's where I'm going.
I vote yes.
Yes, let's do it.
I vote yes.
And they
So
also give you the potential to use even more of those very varietal specific flowers, such as the ones that David Mills all the time. So I would have a blast doing this book. I would have a blast.
Well, I hope you do it. I want to thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you, David. Thank you, Roxana. Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, everybody who joined us. If you joined us late and you want to see the beginning, you can find you will be able to find the whole thing, I think, starting tomorrow at the Cooks Without Borders YouTube channel, which you could just, search for that. We don't have a fancy URL yet on YouTube, but it's all, you can also find that on the Cooks Without Borders homepage through the Mavens tab on the top nav. You can follow Roxana, for instance, at Instagram at, I think it's We Are Friends and at We Are Friends and Family.
Yes, that's correct.
And buy her book immediately if you haven't already, and bake from it. And David is at capaymills.com. Is that right, David?
Yep, you got it.
And we can probably follow you on social media too, but tell us your handle.
Capay Mills, I think Capay_Mills, if I'm not mistaken, on Instagram. That's my main channel there.
So I've been saying it wrong this whole time. It's Capay Mills, and you're too polite to correct me.
Just fine.
Okay, so Capay Mills and Roxana and David, thank you again. And thank you everybody for joining us, and see you next month for whatever we can cook up for you.
Thank you.
Fun. Thanks,
so much.
Leslie.
Thank you.
Okay.
Everybody.
Fun.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Bye.